Hello and welcome to week 2 of our adult small group Bible study. Today we transition to the Gospel of John for this next weekend's reading. And John's Gospel is known to be more theological. And so we'll be here in this Gospel for this week and the next 2 weeks before again returning to the Gospel of St. Mark on Palm Sunday. And so this gives us a little mini retreat for an opportunity for more theological reflection rather than a historical discussion. So before we begin, if you haven't already, please go ahead and mark your Bible for a few of these other passages in Psalms, Jeremiah, Zechariah, and the Acts of the Apostles. And so first we'll examine the context of this story within the Gospel of John. It's early in the Gospel, just chapter 2. And so this portrays Christ's first trip to Jerusalem. And it comes right after the wedding feast at Cana, which will be important later. So this is the first of 4 recorded trips to Jerusalem that John has in his Gospel. And so we'll note that this is different than the other synoptic Gospels, the other 3, Matthew, Mark, Luke. And they place this event, this cleansing of the temple, right before Jesus' passion instead. So toward the end of their Gospels, toward the end of Christ's life and his ministry, rather than the beginning of his public ministry, as here in John. And the ancients' relation to time and space was very different than our own. So we may wonder, why would John do this so differently if that wasn't actually accurate? And so we remember, sometimes we tell stories out of order too. We might call someone up and say, hey, did you hear that this thing had happened? But then we jump back and tell some of the rest of the story that leads up to the exciting part of the event. And so it might be more historically accurate that this cleansing of the temple took place toward the end of Jesus' ministry, because it could have been a precipitating event, something that angered the Jewish leaders and then led to Christ's passion and death. But John is trying to communicate something different. He's trying to communicate something that he feels is more important. And so by placing this event here, John is telling us that Jesus is announcing a change in the kind of worship that we offer to God. And there's a parallel here. So just as water was changed into wine at Cana, just before this passage here, so too the worship of God that was offered in animal sacrifice is instead changed into the worship of the new covenant, and worship in spirit and in truth. Christ began his public ministry at Cana, but in a way he even does so more here with a very dramatic and very prophetic action about this change that's to come into worship. And so we see some startling things. Jesus acting in a way that we're not normally used to seeing him. Jesus is quite worked up. And it's important to realize just how important the temple was in Jewish theology. The temple was the most important biblical institution for the Jews, and happened to be located in the most important biblical city for the Jews, in Jerusalem. And the Catechism still reminds us that Christ, even through this event, had a great respect for the temple. Joseph and Mary presented him in the temple 40 days after he was born. And at 12 years old, he remained in the temple to proclaim to his parents that he needed to do his father's work. And then during his hidden life, in the years between that event at 12 years old and the beginning of his public ministry at age 30, during that hidden life, he would have also gone up to the temple every year, at least, for Passover. And so this temple was this privileged place of encounter with God. It was like going up a mountain, kind of like last week with the transfiguration that took place up high on a mountain. And so here in this picture, you'll see that they had to go up to Jerusalem to climb up there to that city itself at a high elevation, and then climb up again to the Temple Mount, which is the large rectangle at the bottom of the image. So we can also see the outer court surrounding the temple itself, which is likely where the money changers and the vendors were. And as the pilgrim progressed, he came just closer and closer, higher and higher, to an encounter with God. And we read in Psalm 84, we won't use this here today, but they proclaimed in that psalm, "How lovely your dwelling place, O Lord! Better one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere." And so Christ wasn't the only one who thought so highly of the temple. We see here in this passage that there are many people here present for this event. Christ's disciples, obviously the money changers and the animal vendors. We see many Jews in the temple, especially including the Jewish leaders. The Passover was a pilgrimage festival, and so there were likely hundreds of thousands of national and international pilgrims who came to Jerusalem as a very wide audience for this event. And so if this temple was held to be so sacred, so highly venerated, then we could ask too, why were there money changers and animal vendors? Why were they even there in the first place? And so note again that these are international pilgrims who likely had their own currency. They had their own foreign coins that, again, likely had images of emperors or of kings on them. And so if you remember last fall, we had this passage where Jesus proclaims, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar," because using those coins in the temple was a violation of the law from Exodus, not having these graven images. So these pilgrims needed to exchange that currency to pay the temple tax and to be able to buy animals to sacrifice. So therefore we had money changers in the temple. Also, the pilgrims would have had Passover lambs ritually sacrificed at the temple for that feast of the Passover, slaughtered and sacrificed for the nation. And these pilgrims, especially the international ones, wouldn't have wanted to travel very far with their sacrifices, travel that whole way only to offer them in sacrifice. And so, therefore, we see vendors selling these sheep and these birds in the temple, making it available for them. So we can understand that it was, that it was understandable for these money changers and for these vendors to be in the temple in the first place. There was a legitimate need for their help to be able to offer that right sacrifice to the Lord. But we also see here that that privilege had been abused, that they were charging unfair and excessive prices. And so again, we'll note in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that Christ in them calls the temple a den of thieves, that their privilege here in trying to provide this service for the faithful was being abused. That's not what God intended the temple to be. They're supposed to be a place to worship God, but it had become a place that had become essentially worship of money. And so because the sacredness of the temple was therefore being violated, Jesus acted out against that. And so in doing so, he actually fulfills a few different Old Testament references. And so we'll take a look. First, let's flip to Psalm 69, verse 10. Psalm 69, verse 10. And here we read, "Because zeal for your house has consumed me, I am scorned by those who scorn you." And we see both in that psalm and here in Christ's life that commitment to God's cause brings opposition, both in that time and in the time of Christ. We go on to read in that same psalm, Psalm 69, verse 25, "Pour out your wrath upon them. Let the fury of your anger overtake them." And so it was not unheard of, especially when referencing these scriptures, that we have a comparable response to a great injustice. Let's also flip to Jeremiah, chapter 7, verses 3 through 5. Jeremiah 7, 3 to 5. And here the Lord of hosts says, "Reform your ways and your deeds, so that I may dwell with you in this place. Do not put your trust in these deceptive words, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. Only if you thoroughly reform your ways and your deeds, if each of you deals justly with your neighbor." That's what the Lord wants. And so again, Christ and the Jews, they would have agreed about the importance of the temple that's portrayed here. But some Jews took solace in the mere fact that they had a temple. That's all they thought they needed. They thought that they were okay and blessed by God as long as they had that physical building. But God dwells in more than just buildings. He wishes to dwell in our hearts. And so therefore he asks that we reform our ways and that we deal justly with others, which is exactly what the money changers and the vendors were not doing. That's why Jeremiah proclaimed against it, and again why Christ proclaims against it here. Finally, we'll flip to Zechariah chapter 14. There's a story here at the verses 16 to 21. And so that very first one in Zechariah 14:16 speaks of the end times. "Everyone who is left of all the nations that came against Jerusalem will go up year after year to bow down to the King, the Lord of hosts." Speaking of the end times, all these people who will go to worship the Lord in Jerusalem. And then at the end of the story, verse 21, "No longer will there be merchants in the house of the Lord on that day." No longer will there be merchants. Again, the disciples would have brought this verse to mind, seeing Jesus driving out these merchants. And it wasn't because there was not a need for merchants, and maybe it's not in the way that the Jews might have originally thought. Not because God will provide animal sacrifices for them, but instead that God will provide one eternal and lasting sacrifice, Christ, his Son. That was the necessary sacrifice, not that of the animals. And so we see here as well another difference between John and the synoptics, that John's is the only gospel in which Christ refers to this temple, this sacred place, as his Father's house. His authority comes from God his Father to take control of the temple and its worship in this scene. His relationship with his Father gives a certain legitimacy to his astonishing action driving these people away, which drives away the money changers and the animal vendors, but also disrupts that system of sacrifice. They had this laid out system for that to be taking place during Passover. And so of course the Jewish leaders are going to question Jesus. They wonder if he really has good intentions, if he's stopping the very sacrifice that God himself had asked for. And so therefore they ask in this passage what sign he can give that shows his legitimacy, that shows that he has a right to be able to do this. And Christ's words only make sense when we know the whole story. Christ says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And the Jews responded, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" And John goes on to continue in his gospel, but he was speaking about the temple of his body. Therefore, when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this. And so to Christians, it's quite obvious there's no need for the temple when we have Christ himself. And the early apostles, the earliest ones in the church, they understood this too. The Catechism tells us that the apostles kept their reverence for the temple. And we see this in this final passage we'll look at in Acts chapter 2, verses 46 and 47. Acts chapter 2, 46 to 47. And here we read, "Day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they partook of food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. They attended the temple together, and they broke bread in their homes. They met in the temple every day to pray. They respected the reverence of that temple, but also celebrated the Eucharist, that new and lasting covenant, in their own homes." So we see Jesus symbolically took control of the temple and announced changes in the worship of God, that it wasn't just that temple worship, that temple sacrifice that was necessary. It was the new and eternal sacrifice that he offered himself. And so we too continue to participate in this worship of God in the new covenant, as we gather as the new temple, the church of God, to celebrate the Eucharist, especially as we gather on Sunday. And so as you discuss this next weekend's gospel, I invite you to reflect with thanksgiving on our ability to be able to come and to be able to worship in this new covenant, in spirit and in truth. God bless.